most of the participants are already here, and Mariya Yudkevich is starting, and I hand over the floor to you.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me to present the paper, and I'm happy to be a first presenter in the very last session of the conference. Actually, that's a great accomplishment of a 5-day conference, so I understand that you're all pretty tired. So my paper is not exactly a research paper, it's more like a mixture of research and entertainment, because it's devoted to one of the interest university problems. So I do hope that what you learn from this paper, or what you heard from this paper, would make you a little bit entertained, not only get some new ideas. So that's about the university Inbreeding. If you go on the web and Google Inbreeding, you'll learn first that it's not about universities. It's nothing to do with universities, that's about biologists. It's about pets, puppies, cats, dogs, etc. Because in breeding, it's about closed species meeting each other and producing next generations. So actually it's comes from biology. But for the university, that happens to be also very interesting and important topic. That's what I want to talk about. And I will try to explain why it's interesting and why it's important. What we mean when we say inbreeding in the context of the university? When we speak about academic or intellectual inbreeding, we normally refer to the university policy which allow us as universities to bring in as a faculty our former students with almost no or no outside teaching and research experience. So this kind of policy is called inbreeding, and those people are called inbred. So if you are a student which comes from the high school, you spend 5 to 7 years at this university, then you continue as a faculty member, then you are inbred. And there is a huge literature and a huge debate in the literature about whether inbreeding is good or bad. And trying to summarize all the discussion, we can probably focus on the Charles Eliot quote, who said that hiring our own graduates is natural but not wise. For those of you who don't know who Charles Eliot is, I would remind you that one of the Harvard University presidents. So in the beginning of the 20th century, Harvard was a university with a lot of inbred faculty. About 70% of Harvard faculty were initially students at Harvard University. So Charles Eliot was one of the first people who understood how important this problem is and started to work with it. Another authors are Ketlow and McGee in the famous book written in 1958 also mentioned that it's commonly disapproved. So everybody criticizes inbreeding, but many universities still hire their own graduates. And there are some important puzzles associated with inbreeding. I will just try to name a few of those. First, in some countries and some universities, inbreeding is really widespread. For many university systems, when we see our former graduates in the university, that's not part of the life. In other countries, it's strictly forbidden, and in some cases even formally forbidden, not only informally, to take our own graduates into the university. So, and both systems believe that it's a good policy. Okay? So that's a puzzle why it happens that in one system we have one picture, in another system we have another picture. The second puzzle comes from the question, what are the consequences of hiring all grades? Is it a big deal what was their previous academic experience as a person or not? That's another important question. And finally, the question, one more important question is whether there is a difference between people who are inbred and non-inbred. can we say that these people are different not only in terms of experience, but also in terms of productivity, performance, values, and something which is also important for the university? Or they're not that different? When we speak about the consequences of inbreeding, normally in the literature there are at least three groups of important consequences. First, related to research. It's quite often said that if there is inbreeding in the system, there is no fresh air because local rules emerge and people just invest in the local rules because they don't have any outside experience, which is probably not very good. Another consequences for research is that when we speak about which research project to support, we quite often in the inbreeding system support those research which are done by people with high level of seniority. Okay? And seniority becomes more and more important in the university when there is a lot of inbred people. So to become important, you need not to produce good research, but spend a good deal of time at this university. And finally, it's quite difficult to have peer review mechanisms in the system with a lot of inbreeding people, because actually all people know each other, that it's quite difficult to bring a culture which would allow for anonymous peer review. Teaching is also affected by inbreeding culture. Why is that? Because there's a huge class dependency in course curriculum. As a student, you come to the university, you start giving seminars and tutorials for your professor, and you learn from your professor, and the professor is the only source of the information for you. So you just reproduce the same course in the same curriculum. And there's no actual signals of something going wrong in the curriculum, in the case of reading culture. And finally, of course, the overall organizational culture might also suffer from inbreeding because there is a quite big link with external environment. People don't come from outside, so they don't know the global rules of the game. And in this case, their organizational inertia are easily reproduced. So such universities normally have quite big position in the global academic game. There's a huge literature on their academic inbreeding. And the problem is that this literature is very much controversial and gives very mixed results on their input of inbreeding on their research and teaching productivity. First of all, there is some literature on the macro evidence, on the correlation between country level inbreeding and country productivity in terms of publications in top journals. And normally, this literature is quite straightforward and says there is a negative correlation between the share of country level inbreeding, how huge inbreeding is in the system, and what is the share of research papers of this country in the total world output of papers. But if you speak about inbreeding in institutional productivity, there are both results that support the idea that inbreeding is harmful to the institution in general, but also that inbreeding doesn't affect their productivity. And there is some papers which demonstrate that individual productivity also suffer from being inbred. So if you are graded from the university you now work at, normally your productivity is at least slightly lower than for those people who come from outside. Surprisingly, so you might imagine that inbreeding is always bad. So it's important to bring people from outside, to mix the cultures, etc. But surprisingly, there are some cases where inbreeding is not totally bad. And there are some exceptions for this rule. First, if you are from the top university, you probably don't suffer from inbreeding. Because if you are top university, if you are the best university in the world, then your graduates are also best graduates in the world. So in this case, if you accept your own graduates, you accept the best graduates in the world, so you don't suffer. And there are some papers which demonstrate consistent results over different countries. And if you look, for example, on the Harvard or Yale Law School and the law is particular subject, actually some people doubt that it's science or research, but not art. So in the case of law, there is a huge inbreeding which is not that harmful. If you look on the picture of the correlation between the proportion of entry-level inbreeding faculty in the department and productivity, which is on the vertical axis, you can see there is a positive correlation between how many inbred are in the department, and you can see that about 25 top US law department. So we have Yale and Harvard here, Columbia University, NYU, and Stanford in Chicago, etc. So there is a positive correlation, but normally that's not true for non-top universities. What is the reasons for inbreeding? There are both external factors and internal factors which might explain inbreeding. When we speak about external factors, those are factors which can't be affected by universities themselves, which come from outside. So what they are? First, they could be big national academic market. So if there is no market for faculty, it's quite hard to bring people from outside because there is no such cases outside. So you need to grow your faculty by your own. So if there is no market, it's quite hard to provide mobility between universities. Second, as I said, if you are elite university, it's quite hard for you to find good graduates and bring them from outside because you're the best in the market. And also, geographical reasons could be the case as well. If there is low geographical mobility, if it's hard to bring people from outside, you also start hiring your own graduates. But internal factors are also critically important. First, those are financial constraints. And many people argue that inbreeding in the Russian case is, to a large extent, is supported by severe financial constraint. So it's much cheaper. Don't let graduate to go for outside labor market and pay him or her low salary from the very beginning, from starting point of career, then letting him or her going to the labor market, learning the prices of the labor market, and bringing people into the system back again. Also, if universities are concentrated most on teaching, not on research, it's also reasonable to have people from inside, because when you hire a teacher, you can easily learn the teaching abilities when you see him or her as a student. But if you want researcher, you better search for external market in general. And of course, as I'll demonstrate later, culture and also culture plays a critical role in inbreeding. So a couple of I'll probably come to this course later. So thinking about inbreeding, we decided to make a comparative project. Why comparative? Because we tried to learn whether the reasons for inbreeding are produced by some specific country's features, and if we can learn some factors which affect inbreeding for a whole number of countries. So we searched for some number of countries where inbreeding is very widespread. And we tried to find both small countries and large countries, rich countries and more poor countries in terms of spending on their national educational system. And finally we had 8 countries starting from China and Asia, also some countries in Latin America and even Africa and Russia, and also to Ukraine, because in Ukraine is in many cultural things quite close to Russia. So we took 8 countries and we took experts in each country, and each expert ran their own small survey study on the inbreeding in this particular country. And I'll demonstrate some figures which come from this comparative research. Again, that's very descriptive figures, but they allow us to discuss some important features of inbreeding. First, what we learned is that inbreeding is very well correlated with immobility. So in many countries where inbreeding is widespread, there is also single university career structure. So in many of those countries, people die at the university after 50 years working in the same working place. We're not saying that it's bad. Sometimes it's nice to die in a place where you spend a lot of nice years, also your youth years, but just to say that it happens. So in many countries like in Russia, Ukraine, or Spain, where immobility is even higher, so inbreeding is well correlated with immobility. In some countries, and for example South Africa is a case, we have many people who first find their job outside universities they were graded from, and then they have the whole career over there. We also try to learn whether the situation in the country in general and university in general is different from situation in most prestigious, say, top quality universities. And we can see here that some countries demonstrate that there is no difference between, say, average university and top university, but in those countries where there is difference, elite universities are always characterized by the high level of inbreeding. Why is it again? Because if you are the best, the rest is worse than you. For example, in Slovenia case, Slovenia is a very small country, and 80% of graduates are produced by Ljubljana University. So for Slovenia, it's really hard to organize mobility inside the country, because Ljubljana University believes their graduates are the best, and those graduates also believe in that and don't want to go anywhere. So that's a problem. And when we meet with Slovenian experts said they always believe that inbreeding is a problem with a small country. And I said that I always believe that inbreeding is a problem of large country. So we learn from that size sometimes doesn't matter. You can have a problem with inbreeding in 2 universities. If you compare inbreeding of average universities and low quality universities, you can learn also that inbreeding in less prestigious universities quite often is not such a big problem. Why is that? Because in many countries, those low quality universities don't have the core faculty. They normally have faculty who come part-time. In this case, there is no problem with inbreeding. It's not because those universities cope better with inbreeding, just because they don't have good core faculty. As soon as they start hiring, they have this problem as well. Reasons for academic inbreeding. It was quite interesting to learn how experts justify why inbreeding exists in the system. In some countries, experts believe that inbreeding is caused by uncompetitive earnings in academia. That, for example, was the case of Argentina and Russia. But in some countries, experts say, no, low salaries is not what produces inbreeding. At the same time, what was surprising is that some countries reported that social ties is not an important factor for academic inbreeding. For me, that was very surprising results, because I think that inbreeding is quite often reproduced because you carry your own friends or relatives or people you know, etc. And for example, I don't believe in China results, and actually nobody does, because everybody knows that in China there is quite often these networks of important alumni which influence the process. in some countries, experts said that inbreeding is not a policy. Inbreeding is just byproduct factor, in the sense that we always hire best people, and quite often those best people just happen to be our own graduates. Then in many countries, like in Japan, China, and South Africa, for example, that was their explanation for inbreeding. So there's no bias, it just happens like that. And since I have probably only 2 minutes left, I'll try to explain try to summarize how experts explain why breeding is reproduced. First, many people say that there is a huge gap between theory, how employment policy should work like, and how it really works. So in many countries, expert reports, there is open calls for hiring, there's very transparent procedures and competitive procedures for hiring, but in many countries people say just formality, because in reality it doesn't work like that. So you have open calls, but everybody knows that you shouldn't apply for that. And many countries, for example, in Japan or Slovenia or Russia reported like that. So to summarize, that's how the vicious circle of inbreeding looks like. If you have high level of inbreeding, it means that people in the university have very low outside experience. If your outside experience is limited, then understanding of how inefficient your life is also limited, because you just don't know how outside life looks like. In this case, you don't understand what are the alternatives which are available for the university. Then inbreeding is reproduced. And inbreeding is caused by low academic salaries and also in many countries tradition of immobility in the country per se, or in some cases, again like Slovenia, national language policies. So, since it was a huge comparative project, it's really hard to summarize everything in like 15 minutes, so if you want to learn more, there's a paper in the journal which summarizes results of that, and also books which came out in Palgrave Macmillan, which also have extensive case studies on each particular country. Thank you.
All right, since we have no discussants in this session, floor is open for questions. Anna. Oh, we have discussants. Sorry. Frances?
Yeah.
I should have said because you might know it so much, so extensively. I'm sorry. And then it's Mikhail.
Who is also there.
Next.
Thank you. Well, I would like to start by thanking you very much for this nice talk, because inbreeding is an important topic for the life of academicians for many regards, and very often it is just disregarded. It is important because it has to do with how to best promote research, and in particular it deals with the transparency of research, but it also touches on issues such as efficiency and efficacy of the use of the resources that are public resources very often. Sometimes are also private resources, but nonetheless they need to be used effectively. And the third important issue, why I really appreciate this lecture, is that it also raises the problem of the accountability of scholars. Because the risk is that academic society gets too much detached from lay people. And in this way, we are discussing on how to take the academia close to the people it is intended to serve. Now, this is a controversial issue. As you correctly pointed out, there is some literature, but it reaches contradictory results. In any case, the literature, in my opinion, as far as I know, is not, doesn't adopt always same methods, therefore it's difficult to compare the results. But I think that your contribution adopts an innovative method as It contacts experts in various countries and asks them to qualitatively evaluate the situation. So my first question when it comes to qualitative methods is maybe you would like to tell us a bit more on how you identify the experts in each country, and in particular I would be curious to know whether you had the opportunity also to ask students or PhD students to have both the point of view of let's say top academicians and PhD students. And the other thought that I had while listening to you is that very often when we have to deal with such a topic which usually polarizes the opinion, yes it is good, no it is bad, well often it seems to me the answer is in between. Hence I'm wondering and I'm asking you, what do you think of a solution where academia finds a balance between inputting new oxygen and at the same time keeping partly inbreeding? This would, on one side, ensure renovation of ideas, fresh air, and on the other side also keep on going the tradition of the academia. This class is far-reaching. We could also enter into theory of the organization to deal with the possibility of collusive behaviors between professors and students, but this is a far-reaching topic. The last short comment would be, is it possible to validate at least part of the answers you receive with external macro indicators, such as, for example, presence of corruption in the country or confidence in institutions? This is because I would be concerned, in particular, when you were showing some results on people's opinions, people's preferences. I am concerned that some behaviors might be perceived as more or less acceptable. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation and papers. It was extremely interesting for me to see this. I'm coming not from academia, I'm from United Nations Development Program, but many things you discussed is quite relevant and for us as well. And listening to this, I have a couple of points. One thing, as it was mentioned already, these are the things which are polarizing. And you look on negative side, what kind of negative outcomes it brings. But why some universities still use it? Right? What they see as a benefit of this? Because when you face these polarizing questions, you could simply miss benefits which these institutions see and focus on negative side. So it would be interesting to hear from them as well. Second very kind of big question for me would be, what is counterfactual information? How we measure effectiveness, efficiency, and all other things? And this seemingly management problem, it could become interesting topic for discussion, because I don't think you could find one universal indicator for all aspects of university performance. And second, what is more important, even if you find this, and even you mainstream it in university management, these indicators could easily become falsifiable. And if you look all across different practices, GDP is falsified, as a measure of development, right? Recent scandal with Volkswagen environmental things. So these indicators which are guiding administrative decisions, they took some time to falsify. And it would be interesting to see how these indicators could be used better for managing institutions. And third is a proposal. You ask people opinion. And we, for our internal purposes in UNDP, but also for some external purposes, we piloted a very interesting tool called micro-narratives. So basically we collect stories from people. We ask people to ask some story about how you get your job in this university and how you feel about it. But next step is that we ask people to tag these stories, right? So we ask people about emotional load of the story, but we also ask people in this story about cooperation, competition, or corruption, and so on and so forth. And then we cluster these stories. And then some quite interesting things are emerging. Our HR colleagues find out a story about a guy who was hired, and they simply forget to tell him about things that he was hired. And that produced a lot of discussion on how we hire people and what we do there. But we also use it for external things. And for instance, in Kyrgyzstan, we look on jobs, how people find jobs. And if you read stories, it's all about different problems people face. But if you look on tagging, basically everybody says we're looking for job outside of Kyrgyzstan. So it creates quite interesting contrast between real practices and people perception. So maybe it could be interesting to use. Thank you.
Okay, questions? Anna?
Yeah. Thanks a lot. This is more of a clarification question, but after this kind of comments, it needs time to reflect. My question is slightly easy. You have 8 countries, and from the first glance, I would say you have 2 countries by region, world region. But you have China and Japan, Russia and Ukraine. But at the same time, you have only Argentina for Latin America and only South Africa for Africa. Did you consider taking maybe 2 countries in South America or Latin America to be able to do this pairwise comparison, which are kind of natural in terms of all the other 6 countries or something? I'm just wondering how to do that.
So maybe Mariya can react to the
Sure.
discussants and to the question,
Yes,
and then we
absolutely.
can collect
Yeah.
one or not.
Thank you very much for comments and proposals. Everything looks very interesting. All the things about are some answers to questions. First, about experts and how experts were selected. First, we identified experts in each country who worked previously on the inbreeding issue and who was interested in breeding. And then we're sure that for this country there is enough data to work on about inbreeding. So we're in some countries, for example, they took part in the Euro Act study. In other countries took part in the changing period professional studies. All these national surveys had some data on inbreeding and mobility, so experts use those kind of data to enter those respondents to get extra data on inbreeding. That's how data are collected. But in the projects we do like that, we normally take a lot of care about searching for these first level experts, and then we trust those people in the methods of collecting qualitative data. That's how we work. I like a lot this idea on the micro stories, and in some another paper with my Portuguese colleague, we did exactly. We use methods like that. We ask vice rector for research and vice rector responsible for hiring, asking them to write stories about how they search for people, and then we use this narratives to learn more about the policies. So that's really work pretty good and pretty interesting. About the balance between oxygen and the open window in the winter, we get extra air, but it's getting too cold very quickly, so we need to find a balance how to make it both warm and fresh at the same time. And of course, this balance always depends on the mission of the university. And I believe if the mission is more linked toward teaching, then we use more inbred people, because that's the way how we keep our institutional learning and institutional memory to produce good teaching from generations to generations. And if we are more interested in research, then we bring more people from outside. And you can easily see this shift in Russian universities. When the Russian universities were more interested in teaching, we had much more inbreeding than now. And now, when Russian universities are forced to do more research and also are evaluated by research results, they start looking in outside options as well. And we can easily see that in last decade. So missions are changing, balance is changing as well. About falsification of indicators. You can falsify everything. And you need to falsify so many indicators, so sometimes it's just better just focus on the job you're doing without thinking about how to falsify that. Because otherwise you will be trapped in this clouds of indicators. Because it's again easily seen on the Russian experience in these international rankings. Rankings are both good and bad for universities, and there are a lot of indicators, and all indicators could be falsified. But then you start, say for example, you want to produce more research, and to produce more research, you need to fire people who don't do any research. That's how you improve your research indicators. But if you fire some people, you have small ratio of students per teacher, and that goes you back down in the ranking. So it's better to focus on the real job and not to care too much about these indicators. That's how it works. And validation of results, that's a tricky issue. What we do, we look on the research performance, which is measured by research papers. That's the easiest way to measure the performance. Since teaching performance is very hard to measure, we focus on research one. And most papers do really do that. And about countries. That's a difficult question. Is 8 too small number or too large one? But when you learn a lot about 8 countries, you understand that all countries are different, but in another sense, all countries are more or less the same. And you learn quite quickly that the list of reasons and consequences from reading is a very short one. And the question of how you mixture these ingredients in each particular country. But at some point, if you add extra country, you don't learn anything valuable. Okay. You know this quote from Leo Tolstoy that all happy families are alike and all unhappy families are unhappy in their particular way. That's what happens with inbreeding as well.
Okay, maybe one more question, and then I have to close this. Mariya.
First of all, maybe I'll okay, first of all, thank you for extremely thought-provoking presentation, and my question regards the career trajectories of many of my U.S. friends, mostly in humanities, who graduate from Ivy League schools with flying colors, and because of the job markets in humanities nowadays in U.S. and many countries, they have to go to community colleges. They complain about teaching overload, about their research being unappreciated, about their courses irrelevant to the experience of students who hardly ever left their state, let alone the country, and they teach European history or something. And my question is, to what extent this predictable career trajectory has the same effect as inbreeding, because it's a sort of a very predictable career trajectory come to a university as an undergrad, and you leave it, just as you said, entirely or whatever. And another question about these people who graduate from first-rate universities and go to third-rate universities in their own country. What are the ways of breaking the sort of country level inbreeding? For example, what attracts such teachers, scholars to universities like the High School of Economics?
First, I'm not sure that I got your second question, because there's no such a thing as country level inbreeding, because moving from one university to another one in the same country is not that harmful as staying in the same university. So probably it's not that important that you stay in this particular country. The first problem that you raised is a very important one, and of course, for a person who was not able to find a decent job in top-tier research university, and if he or she wants to stay in academia, there is no much choice in terms of where to go. And that demonstrates that our stereotype about, for example, US system, which is often considered as very mobile academic system, is not actually valid. Because when we say that US system is very mobile, we normally speak about top-tier research universities and research stars. But normally, if you think about average career of a US scholar, average means community college or not very good non-research university, that's exactly the same problem which is in many European countries. And this career in community colleges is quite often this either a trunk or single university career. And of course, that has a huge impact on research, productivity, and even STEAM academia. And that's a very important problem that you mentioned.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we move on to